Cassie O'Connor, Outside Services Director at Glue Mobile and member of the XDS Advisory Board. Today, I get the privilege of introducing Sam Carlisle, Director of External Partner Relations at Microsoft Xbox Game Studios. Sam is someone I've known for many years, and like me, you probably look forward to his talks at every XDS event. I'm telling you now, this one is good. Sam's presentation on external supplier crunch, origins, impact, and solutions guidance addresses a large challenge in our industry. When starting the discussion with Sam, I was under the assumption that I wasn't the problem. After this, well, I can't confidently say that anymore. I'll let Sam further explain. So over to you, Sam.
I've been working in external development for the best part of 15 years, and I feel I should start with a confession. I've done crunch as a games artist in the UK and as an artist in India. I've worked crunch as an outsource manager. I've been the cause of crunch as an outsource manager. I have felt the toll the stress can take on your health and how it spreads to your family and relationships. Yet as demonstrably unhealthy and as unproductive as crunch is, in a twisted way, some of my most memorable moments and proudest achievements have come after crunching. I'm both a victim and a perpetrator, and I don't think I'm the only one. I'm telling you this because there is a lack of research and a lack of data on external crunch, which means my examinations, theories, and proposed solutions are coloured by my experiences, and you should take that into account. In 2004, the famous EA spouse letter shone a light on the levels of overtime worked by her husband and the terrible toll that took on their lives and health. The origin may have been personal, but the story was familiar to almost everyone in the industry. This year, the People Make Games report gave a voice to those working for our external suppliers who are experiencing crunch. In much the same way, although the stories came out of one region, their words will have struck a chord with the industry workers across the world. There is no pretending this is a localized issue or a new one. We work in a wonderful, creative and passionate industry. We collaborate, integrate and we grow with our external partners. Our most resource-intensive games can take years to build. We bond over that time, and I'm not alone in calling many of them my friends. With all that in mind, we must be honest and look to ourselves and ask the hard question. Are developers exploiting their external partners? The People Make Games report posed that we could be outsourcing crunch, a point I fundamentally disagreed with, and so did every external development manager I spoke to. The overtime experiences were shared by suppliers, and they were familiar to us developers. We have all crunched. We can relate, right? We have empathy, or at least we think we do. If we are exploiting crunch, that would mean internal teams aren't crunching, because they'd be taking the hit on our behalf. So how can it be, if we crunch too, and we're in this together? It makes sense, and this is where my bias can't help but kick in, because I don't want to believe that we are exploiting our partners. However, after looking at the data, or rather the absence of data, I can no longer say that for sure. So how did we get here? And where do we go?
What is crunch? In the broadest sense, crunch is overtime that is most often unpaid and continues for an extended duration. In a fascinating investigation into gaming overtime by a team at the University of Gothenburg, they identified 4 types of crunch. Continuous or rolling crunch, crunch that goes on throughout the majority of the project until the game is complete. Final, one big crunch for the last couple of weeks of the project before that final deadline. Mini, multiple crunches throughout the project that do not last longer than a fortnight each. And delusional, when the studio truly believes that they are not crunching, yet the staff works overtime and spends late nights at the office. Delusional crunch was a new one on me. This tends to be referring, I think, to smaller devs caught up in the passion of it all and not really noticing the time. I think it can be remodeled for external crunch, where the management are unaware of the level of overtime being worked, whether that is the management at the supplier or the developer. In terms of impact on well-being, continuous rolling crunch causes the most damage. It's the crunch which tends to happen in full production, and full production is unfortunately where most of our outsourcing takes place. So if an external partner is going to crunch, then the chances are they're going to do it for a long time.
Everyone was so stressed out. I had a friend who cried at work in the bathroom too, because she couldn't handle it.
Take This, a mental health charity, released a report in collaboration with the IGDA. I'm going to quote directly, as the data is loud and clear. There is no good side to sustained overtime, whether that's health or productivity. Compared to people who work normal working hours, people working 55 hours a week or more are at a higher risk for heart disease and stroke incidents. Overtime workers were found to have significantly higher anxiety and depression levels and a higher prevalence of anxiety and depressive disorders compared with those working normal hours. 51% of employees said they were less productive at work as a result of stress. In a national Australian survey, employee cognition increased for hours worked up to 25 per week. Beyond that, cognitive abilities decreased. By 60 hours of work per week, cognition was lower than people who weren't working at all. Each year, depression costs US employers $44 billion in just lost productivity alone. If you compare outsourcing to in-house development, there is a difference. For outsourcing, there are so many projects, one after another. So crunch will happen in both outsourcing and in-house, but there's even less downtime for outsourcing before the next crunch happens. There's always new projects and more overtime for the whole year. Given that the subject of supplier crunch is only now getting the focus it deserves, given the horrific impact, how guilty are both suppliers and buyers of fostering it with a cyclical distortion of shared experience through war stories and a misplaced rose-tinted sense of pride? In the University of Gothenburg study, they examined 78 postmortems, where they found the three most prominent reasons for crunch were excessive or unclear scope, feature creep, and deadlines. These ring true with the interviews I've read, and I expect they ring true for most developers, including myself. Scope and creep are driven by production and design. Deadlines are the byproduct of when they hit cost and time. Cost and time, that's where the external suppliers come in. This is, after all, a two-way street. What's the supplier's contribution to this? Ironically, a lot of the reasons seem to be the same. They're around poor planning. The substance of poor planning is the over-promising of deliverables.
You need to say, I have 100 or 150 people, and we can do this much in this much time. That gets you in the door, and after that, you negotiate a price point. Oftentimes, the artist scheduling is the part that ends up getting squeezed. Sometimes, it doesn't sound like a lot. Maybe you're just going to squeeze it by 5%, but 5% suddenly becomes 2 weeks of really late hours.
Cost equals time. If you reduce the cost, you then stretch the resources in order to compensate. And the drivers for this can be the supplier bidding in low, knowing that they're risking crunch to meet delivery, or the buyer seeking a bargain, even though they know it'll increase the chances of crunch. And either side of this coin is exploitation. There is the fear, especially amongst the smaller suppliers, that to compete in the local market, you'll need to equal or even undercut the competition to win contracts. Buyers can leverage the size or prestige of a project to play suppliers off each other or hang the threat of switching the work over to someone else mid-project. Indications are that with the expanding industry demand, this is less of an issue than it was, say, 6 to 10 years ago. However, I'm not going to stand here and say that it doesn't happen, and that it isn't something that can't still be exploited. I do have skin in this game. I've negotiated countless contracts with discounted rates, usually for volume, duration, or retainers, or a combination. I guess worse than that, I've baked them into agreements that multiple developers can benefit from. Am I ensuring a wide-scale supplier crunch? Am I a boss-level baddie? I'd hope not, as there's nothing unusual about this trade. No matter what business you're in, there is a value to duration and volume. It allows our partners to lock in resources for a long time. It gives predictability to their revenue. It reduces internal overheads, enabling stability and growth. The discount should be taken as part of the extra profit that then helps to generate. Provided it's negotiated openly and in good faith, it should benefit both parties. Each supplier is different. There are too many variables to give any kind of overarching advice. What I can do is recommend one piece of advice and give suppliers some numbers to think about. When profit margins are too tight, you can be part of a successful development, crunch, and lose money. The VFX company Rhythm & Hughes filed for bankruptcy after winning a BAFTA while working on the Oscar winner Life of Pi. As I said, each company is different when it comes to working out where their safe profit margin is. So here are some publicly available numbers to bear in mind when finding your safe margins. The movie and TV VFX profits average around 3 to 5%. The game service industry averages around 4 to 7%. Game development around 15 to 20%. You need to find the range that works for you. And my advice? Win-win or walk away. The result of negotiation has to be that both parties benefit. If you must crunch to win, then you've lost.
Crunch has been explored, written about and researched thoroughly with regard to game development studios. But I want to do is explore the link and its transition point to our external partners. The best external development managers are well-organised diplomats. Even if you are doing your job well, the chances are you're upsetting someone, either internally or externally. Outsourcing is the output of internal production and so is subject to its fluctuations. Game development is driven by dependencies, and we need to have several components in place to outsource successfully. The alignment of those dependencies rests with producers who are often employing the agile development technique to break the problem down into its component parts. They then develop those parts during sprints, which then govern the deadlines. If something new or unexpected interferes, then we adjust scope, resources, or schedule. When we get these affecting our ability to deliver on a sprint, do we stick to the principles of Agile? The Gothenburg study used an approach called the OPS framework, developed by Savitha Soundaranjan and her team at Virginia Tech, to evaluate the effectiveness of Agile methods across 4 developers. They employed it to evaluate the developers against key Agile principles: frequent delivery, empowering teams, accommodating change, continual stakeholder participation, frequent reflection, and constant development pace. Developers 3 and 4 had a minuscule level of crunch. In general, the developers who most adhere to these principles of Agile are far less likely to crunch. The one principle the 2 most successful developers have in common is accommodating change. As an industry, we employ Agile in a very tailored way. Even teams within a studio will apply Agile differently. OPS stands for Objective, Principles and Strategies. And although rather dense to read, this table shows how they apply to evaluating Agile. I just want to focus on one key strategy named for successful implementation of that key principle: accommodating change. Unfortunately, a key strategy for delivering this successfully is high bandwidth communication. And communication is often the first area to get hit as resources get stretched. Not only this, but it is easier to implement strategies such as high bandwidth communication internally. The IGDA Developer Satisfaction Survey shows a steady improvement in dealing with crunch. However, we don't know if this extends out to our external partners. Developers may be improving while they stand still. The concern here is that developers are getting better at accommodating the impact of that change by ramping up and ramping down suppliers, or by expanding the volume either with existing partners or by adding new ones. And this is evidenced by flexible skill set ramp up and ramp down being the top reason for 2 out of the last 3 years for supplier engagement. The time the client tells you comes from a person who's usually lived with the project for years. They know it really well. They know the tools, they know the process. If you tell them it takes 25 days to make an asset, they will subconsciously arrive at an estimate that's very close to that. We've a natural tendency to focus on cost when talking about outsourcing. Even when we think we aren't, we are. Time is, after all, money. The top 3 priorities for the last 3 years in the XDS Insight report for engaging with external service providers have been building more content and features, a flexible skill set ramp up and ramp down, and cost savings. Cost has always come in third. However, time ties cost to content building and to flexibility. Therefore, it flows that how time is managed, reported, and paid for is the beating heart of crunch. Poor planning is frequently cited as a cause of overtime. Yet, as we have seen many times at XDS, there is a high level of effort, care, and expertise that goes into external development planning. So how does it happen? Even if we consider everything covered so far, we can still end up in crunch. So we start with a considered ramp up and ramp down. We plan internally to support that sensible resource schedule. And then real life happens. And our sensible schedule looks like this. And right here is the crunch. If our top reasons to employ suppliers are to build content with flexibility to accommodate just this type of scenario, then what's happening in that red area that causes crunch?
While at Sumo Digital, I worked for several months at their art studio in Pune, India. I had an apartment about a mile away, and quite often I get an auto rickshaw in. It was never much money, so I used to pay whatever they asked. However, when the Indian artists at the studio found out about this, they told me I had to stop, and I couldn't quite understand why. The drivers weren't exactly on a fortune, and I was a nice little extra earner for them. They explained that the drivers knew where I worked because they dropped me off there, so they would raise their prices for everyone they dropped off or picked up from the studio. Maybe by not as much, but certainly higher. So from then on, I would have to haggle with the rickshaw drivers. And I have to say, a sweaty Englishman arguing the toss with a rickshaw driver is not a good look. But when I got to the real price, I found out just how much they were overcharging me by. And if they were bumping up the cost by anywhere near that to the Indian artists, I was costing them a lot of extra money.
Why am I telling you this? Because the same principle applies. When an artist puts in extra hours without logging them, it distorts the actual time it takes for all. Their motives may be decent, but there are unintended consequences. It means a producer can, in all good faith, submit an estimate without knowing that the actual time is longer. And when they double check with their lead artist, the lead will naturally lean towards times based on a senior, as it'll align with their own. This is a passionate creative industry. Sometimes we get into the flow and we work longer as a result. When we're learning our craft, we can be slower and we put in more hours to reach that right standard. And it's okay to acknowledge that. But be very careful we're not exploiting it. We have to ensure the ramp up into the project is properly accounted for, allowing contingency for bumps along the way. As the engagement progresses, make sure that you continue to track, adjust, and refine those numbers. It's essential that your staff give you their honest, accurate hours. This is not as straightforward as it sounds. If there's already a culture of crunch within your studio, or there are employees who aren't making you aware of the extra hours they're putting in, you must strive to build a culture that allows for it. You'll need to foster a studio environment from the very top that encourages your staff to be able to report without fear of reprisal. Developers, we will need to accept that there could be extra costs attached to these more granular estimates. Understand that you're facing similar traps with your estimates. Factor in the studio's bandwidth before you need to add extra internal resources to keep up with the external deliverables. When it comes to art, sometimes people in management positions think it's easy to make lots of changes without realizing what that means on the ground level. It's like a waterfall. Everything flows down from the top. Whoever's on the lowest level will end up working too much in the evenings and the weekends. At the first company I worked for, I would work 60-hour weeks or more most weeks. I'm going to employ a fictional case study here. Please bear in mind that all the numbers I use in this section are estimates based on my anecdotal experience. They will vary significantly between suppliers, developers, and projects. So here are the capacities of our artists. We have a nice mix of seniors, mid and junior, and we've allowed time to onboard the supplier into the project. So we can estimate a ballpark effective efficiency rate for each experience level, knowing that they have a complete brief, they're getting timely feedback, quality feedback, onboarded into the project, and there is an effective lead to artist ratio. Working with our partners, We know the assets they'll need to turn around and the time to set our target velocity, so together we agree the resources to meet it. And we hit a big scope change. It'll mean twice the work, but that's okay, because we have the budget to accommodate this by doubling our artists. Except these artists are new, and our internal team isn't exactly built for flexibility, so doubling doesn't mean we're coping. Fact is that the tools we have to get the best out of the team all take a hit. As a developer becomes stretched, the knock-on effect becomes apparent, lowering the percentage of efficiency. Briefs are rushed and incomplete, feedback is slower and of lower quality, and these artists aren't onboarded into the style and technical requirements yet, and the lead artist time is now overburdened. When this hit is accounted for, the doubling actually leaves us short. To hit the same target, they will have to work at least 11 hours a day. But if we were sensible, we allow for 20% contingency. That reduces it by only an hour a day. And there is another problem. This is a doubling of the same team structure as before. It's very unlikely that you secured the same ratio of seniors to mid to junior. So forget the doubling. If we want to ensure that there's enough artists not to crunch, then it looks more like this. Not with 20 artists, but 35. And kudos to you if you're the manager who got the green light to add an extra 75% to a budget that had already doubled. However, if you didn't get the internal resources to handle it too, then your budget is blown and you're crunching. These are some and not all of the factors that adversely affect supplier performance during ramp. I haven't touched on the effect that it has on the original supplier team. Also bear in mind that the research shows unhappy employees are 12% less effective than those who have a comfortable work-life balance. Ramping without allowing for the time needed to onboard the extra supplier resources and the internal resources to keep up equals crunch. My theory is these hidden figures are a major source of overtime crunch. Before delving into solutions, I wanted to touch upon the blacklisting suppliers who have been known to crunch. I understand the motivation behind it. We don't want to endorse or encourage studios that employ crunch to deliver by continuing to work with them. However, I would be cautious. Given the number of variables involved, given that the hiring studio can play a big part, and that we are a long way from solving the problem of crunch in developers, ask yourselves first, are we contributing to their crunch? Or if they are crunching on projects outside of ours, are those developers contributing to it? I feel you would need to be sure that the issue is a systemic, unsolvable part of the supplier's culture before going ahead. Crunch is endemic in our industry. We could easily be blacklisting one supplier just to work with another that hides it better. During my research into solutions, I saw a lot of focus on employment law. Earlier this year, the Washington Post ran a piece on how crunch starts with labor laws. Although it focuses on the US, it's not uncommon to hear the accusation that developers are able to take advantage of overtime in other countries due to their lack of employee protections. I also felt that this tied in with the view that some country work cultures actively contribute to the pressure to put in the long hours.
In an article for the Washington Post, Michael Thompson proposed that often the best explanation for crunch is that it's driven by inadequacies with the employment law. Fundamentally, we're overworked in law because we can't be punished for it. If the law required pay for every hour of overtime worked, then the industry would have to change or pay up. And while I agree that enforcing overtime pay would focus production on minimizing the hours worked, I'm not so convinced that it's a big enough incentive. With live services, we can see games that continue to crunch while they're making money. Perhaps that overtime cost could be the difference between profitability and loss. I examined one live service with confirmed reported crunch and discovered that you could have trebled the workforce, trebled their salaries based off the average US industry salary at the time, and the development cost still wouldn't have reached 5% of revenue. At this point, I feel it unlikely that paying overtime would change anything, and I don't think it can be held as a primary driver. Where there has been success is where the law limits the number of overtime hours you're allowed to work. So for example, Sweden,
where it's illegal to work over 50 hours of overtime in a month or 200 in a year. Where there has been reports of crunch, they are very much in the minority. The test for whether this works when introduced into a country with a culture of overworking will be in Japan. In 2019, they brought in significant changes to their employment law, including overtime cannot exceed 45 hours per month or 360 hours per year. Employer penalties included up to 6 months in prison. They were not messing around. However, there is a loophole. If a company gets busy because, for example, there is a change in product specs, then the employer can invoke the extended limit rule, allowing 100 hours of overtime a month for 6 months. That's 15-hour days in a standard week, or 12.5-hour days in a 6-day week. Even so, with this change on the horizon, a producer at Konami said in an interview in Vice in 2018, "The Japanese government has a policy of work reform, so other developers have seemed to have changed. Now it feels like our industry focuses on how to make the little time we have most effective." Perhaps this is evidence of the incoming law forcing a change. Given the get-out clauses, there are reasons to remain skeptical. We'll see. On the flip side, if developers must lower their hours and maintain costs, then the incentives to employ more external support will only grow. And there's anecdotal evidence that the Japanese studios are doing just that. These loopholes are common. The EU Working Time Directive that limits working hours to 48 hours per week allows employees to voluntarily opt out if their company asks them to. As we saw, for those managing external partners, laws limiting overtime hours and enforcing pay would also have to reside in the same countries as your partners to have a meaningful impact. Therefore, I believe that even if effective, the regional variations mean that for external development, we cannot look to changes in law for near future solutions.
Maybe you're just going to squeeze it by 5%, but 5% suddenly becomes 2 weeks of really late hours.
I first saw this graph with reference to COVID. A normal person sees things as going okay for the majority, and then the exponential growth just shoots up here. A biologist sees exponential growth at every point on the graph. Even if you fix the resource fluctuations, unless you also fix the estimates versus actuals problem, then you will still crunch. The VFX industry has a much more predictable, fixed approach to resources, which is not as affected by change to the same extent as the games industry, and they still crunch. The exponential growth is fueled by multiple factors affecting the ability to turn around an asset at the same velocity with the same predictability. To avoid this, we have to see external production as a weighing scale with the objective to achieve a perfect balance between the internal and external resources required to keep up momentum.
In Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed, on the second lap, I think, of the Afterburner level, there's a submarine that surfaces way off in the distance. Except there isn't. It should be there. I spent way too much time trying to work out why it stopped surfacing. In the final big crunchy push to gold, I kept coming back to that submarine, and eventually I had to let it go. Although frustrating, there were too many, far more important bugs to fix.
I bring this up because if crunch has a positive, then you see it in the final push crunch, where the deadline is immovable. Now all hands are on deck. Hard calls must be made on what stays, what goes, and where the priority lies. Calls that were previously agonized over and delayed are now made decisively. There's a ruthlessness to resource allocation to ensure the core of the game is stable and the core experience is delivered. Poor production and planning is frequently cited as the two main drivers of crunch. The Gothenburg report is more specific. Excessive or unclear scope and feature creep are. So here's what I propose. We crunch the wrong thing. We crunch people when we should crunch decisions. In terms of external development, it means the internal production teams crunch the decisions necessary to ensure your budgeted external resources have everything in place to deliver. Game development is not a straight line. However, how often are we guilty of delaying and overindulging our explorations into features and scope creep during full production? is it that making these decisions is a harder conversation to have than simply tasking the dev team to explore them? When that team is already running near capacity is when we tend to lean on the flexibility of our external partners to accommodate these requests. If we want to create that final push focus, then we'll need a hard stop. It's almost impossible to solve crunch while crunching. At best, you tend to punt the problem into the next sprint and we crunch again, dragging our external suppliers with us. The exponential curve shows how the problem must be solved in phase 1, the start line, with phase 2, acceleration, seen as a last chance saloon. There was a concept introduced by Toyota into their manufacturing factories called the Anden cord. Any worker could stop production if they discovered a significant issue. Production stops until fixed. Short to mid-term harm for long-term gain. While there are obvious differences between game development and manufacturing, this is a principle I believe external development would particularly benefit from. This is not stopping all game production, but it's to set a hard limit on when the calls are to be made by, thus ensuring internal teams can work with their suppliers to deliver realistic external ramp-up and resource schedules. It would require studio leadership to empower external or outsource managers in order to do this. How often is outsourcing reactive? How often is it the release valve? How often is it used to resource our way out of a situation or a difficult decision? Instead, let's pull the Anden cord at the start line of crunch.
The truth is, crunch happens because we allow it to. This industry and its suppliers have often circumnavigated the law by not actually asking staff to work overtime. Instead, we allow it. And with that, we enable the psychological pressure, we enable the implied threat to careers, and we exploit passion. There is one way to solve crunch for both developers and suppliers. And please bear in mind all that I've investigated and proposed so far, because I don't want you to think that I'm saying this lightly. The solution to crunch is don't crunch. Downhill skiers slaloming through a forest avoid colliding with trees by not focusing on the tree. If they focus on not hitting the tree, then they're more likely to hit it. It's called target fixation. The way between the trees is actually much wider than the trees themselves, and so that's what they focus on. So instead of trying to avoid or mitigate crunch, we should be focusing on what happens if we don't crunch. And we come back to planning and feature creep being cited as the two top causes, and for me this translates into solving planning and resources and scope and budget. In this session we have covered tools to help developers and suppliers to work together to achieve this. In planning and resources, we must be looking at creating the environment for honest, accurate supplier task estimates. We plan for sensible resource ramp lead-in times. We have a time allowance for our blend of experience levels at the supplier. And we have a consideration for the impact on quality and timeliness by internal processes such as feedback loops and briefs, etc. And we stick to the principles of Agile. For scope and budget, crunch decisions, not people. Empower our suppliers and our external development managers to pull that Anden cord early to force the decision-making process. And win-win or walk away. And guess what? Doing the right thing comes with some big advantages thrown in for free. Here's a few. 12% improvement in productivity of unhappy employees, higher employee retention rate and better candidates, fewer sick days and less rework. See, Sweden not only has strict limits on overtime hours, they also have several leading studios declare that they won't crunch. In a competitive employment market, that's a very big draw. However, I don't know that this extended out to making sure their suppliers didn't crunch too. And given that AAA games don't get made without external suppliers, it's time to explicitly commit to it. Otherwise, we will outsource crunch. So my suggestion is, let's change "our studio doesn't crunch" to "we make games without crunching." Investigating external supplier crunch has been a challenging and at times deeply uncomfortable journey, and one that I know is only just beginning. Supplier crunch is often happening time zones away, and so for those suppliers who are exploiting their staff, that distance makes it easier to hide. While for developers who are driving external crunch, that distance makes it easier to overlook. Suppliers need to look at the culture of their company and understand its impact with honesty, while developers need to actively search for signs of external crunch both internally and externally and show some leadership. I love the external development community. I am proud of what it achieves. We touch upon almost every aspect of the game development experience, and in many cases, we make games possible. However, we're guilty of hearing phrases like, the team really pulled all the stops out, or went that extra mile, without trying to understand what that fully entailed. What was the cost to health, to quality of life, and to family? We should be looking to these phrases as potential red flags. My misplaced pride in achievements during crunch really was twisted. When I look back at my time as an outsource manager, I must have played my part in supplier crunch. And not just the final push all pulled together with time to recover crunch, but also the soul-sapping, damaging, rolling crunch. And not being aware at the time is no excuse, and I can only apologise to those affected. It's easy to get lost in the practicalities of attempting to solve this problem in production. In the data, in the methodology and the management. Games are complex, difficult beasts, and we become so absorbed in the process that we forget to look up. And that's what the People Make Games report did. It gave a voice to the distant front lines. It made us look up. We are at a dangerous inflection point. As games become more live services, games production becomes more continuous. If we don't start to solve this now, then we risk partner crunch also becoming continuous, with no end in sight. My hope here is to move the process forward a little. Whether you agree or disagree with my analysis, conclusions or suggestions, the fact is we know crunch is wrong. So let's stop focusing on trying to make it righter. Instead, let's commit to navigating the right path.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cassie O'Connor from Glue Mobile, and I'm part of the XDS Advisory Committee. And with us, I have our fabulous presenter, Sam Carlisle from Xbox Studios, and we are going live with our Q&A session. So if you have any questions, make sure to add them into that box so that we can see them, and we'll get going. So the first question we have is from Carla, and it's how much responsibility should a developer have for tracking and solving crunch that could be happening with an external partner?
The tracking question is a really good one. And there was a little bit of the session that I had to cut out regarding tracking and how we monitor it. It's difficult to do because there's a lot of variables and a lot of reasons why somebody would be reluctant to give feedback on whether or not they were crunching, or whether an artist was crunching or not. But we do need to have some kind of monitoring systems in there, whether that's something that's quite granular, that allows us to be able to see what's happening within teams or teams overall, or studios and studios attached to projects, or whether we go, if we can't do that, if we look at something that's a lot more open, such as the IGDA tracks crunch in terms of sentiment and in terms of estimate of how often you do it as an industry overall, once every couple of years. We can certainly do that, and I believe the IGDA are actually going to include external suppliers in their surveys from now on. But monitoring how we do is very important. We don't at the moment. We don't even have a baseline, and I would love to hear some ideas in the session. We're working the table talk sessions later this week on how we can actually set about monitoring where we are now and whether or not we're improving in future.
Second question is from Junie, and it said, what are some red flags you've noticed on the job on both sides?
Like I say, the phrases about how you're working do pop up, but I think also the biggest red flag is what's happening at your studio. How many hours are you working? Are you seeing teams starting to work? Are you seeing things overwork? Are you starting to see things being more rushed in your studio? Because it just translates back over. And they're going to be suppliers often going to be far less reluctant to talk to you about it and to let you know. They just want to be sure that they're doing a good job and pulling through. So really look to your own studio first. Secondly, the close relationship you can build up with your external partners. And we talk a lot at XDS about honesty and trust. And I think it's a real test of that trust. Does it genuinely exist if the suppliers are able to say to you, hey, look, we are now overworking and this is our problem, or we're about to start overworking. And so in an ideal world, you do have a level of trust with your supplier that allows that. But I think your biggest red flags, they're all internal.
Great. And this kind of feeds into the next question by Lexi. Have studios ever hidden crunch from you? Like you said, like you can recognize crunch on your side, but what if you feel that maybe the studio is hiding crunch? How do you work with them to address that?
Honestly, I don't know. Because we are kind of addressing this as an industry for the first time now. Like this hasn't really come up before. We've not talked and worked with our partners about addressing this before in the same way. I think the first step to being to do anything, solving any problem, is recognition. So if you want to help your supplier overcome a crunch that they're hiding, and again, the signs are probably going to come from your side that you're crunching, that you know that there's struggle. Again, I just thinking about it, more mistakes creeping in. So I looked earlier at some of the damaging signs of crunch in terms of productivity. You start to see that happening in your assets coming back. It may be one of the reasons is down to the fact that they're overworked. But in terms of working with a supplier to help solve that, it's going to be first you've got to recognize the problem, and you've got to get them to own up to it, because there are several stages of hiding crunch. The artist can hide the fact that they're crunching, especially now with work from home. The producer can then hide from their senior management that they're crunching, because they're just looking to get a good cadence of work going out. And so the senior management can be quite happy to, I wouldn't say deliberately, but they can turn a blind eye almost accidentally. They can turn a blind eye because they don't particularly want to believe it's happening. And especially now with work from home, that makes it even easier. So if there is a sign of crunch, if there is a suspicion of crunch, if there's any kind of report of crunch, you've got to believe it. You've got to make sure the suppliers are actually believing their staff when this is happening. Because I think there's just a bit of a tendency to rationalize it. And we tend to look backwards to our own past to rationalize it as well. We tend to think, oh, well, I did it a bit. And, it's expected, it's part of it. So first up, recognize it with your partner, and then with your supplier, and then look to your supplier to put some systems in place to help manage that. Find out where it's coming from, whether it's coming from estimates, whether it's coming from pockets. There may be a particular part of the project that's causing that issue. There may be particular types of assets that they're struggling with in that respect. The answers will all lie with the people who are on the front line. They're the people who are going to be able to tell you. You've got to be able to get reports directly from the artist or directly from whichever discipline is working on your project to be able to find out how to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question about kind of identifying the issues before they even start. So what questions can developers ask external partners about their studio culture to uncover potential issues that could lead to crunch?
Good question. So this is we're talking now about the due diligence phase, really, what you can do in those early phases. I think one, you may need to have a look at if they actually have a HR department, they have that kind of facility in there, and how that's integrated with the employees. It's always great if you can talk to employees, to the staff, to the people you're working with directly. You can tend to get a few clues from that. One of the things we do when we're doing due diligence, we do tend to, when we do country due diligence, we may be working with a partner, but we also go and see the other suppliers in that area. And one of the interesting things about doing that is that we move around a lot in this industry. So if you have a new supplier that you're working with, if you go and speak to some of the other suppliers, they will tend to have people who have worked there before. And so they don't have any reason to hide. So you may well find that talk to other suppliers, they say, hey, well, supplier A that you're working with has a really bad reputation for crunch. I left, we get quite a few of our staff from there because they left because of the amount of work they were doing, etc. So maybe have a look at if you can, speak to the surrounding suppliers as well, even if you're not working with them, and just see if you can get a flavor of some of the reports out of there. You may actually find that some suppliers will almost promote the fact that they're willing to crunch. They talk about how hard they work and what they're willing to do and stuff. So those are the obvious red flags to it. And then Also have a look at their production. How mature is it? How well are they tracking their own stuff? What kind of practices have they got in place that means that they would be able to pick it up? I think those could probably all help put towards it. But again, early days in this topic, and I would love to hear people's thoughts on this when it gets to the table topic session as well, because there's so much that we can explore around here.
Yeah. As a developer, is due diligence needed to eliminate crunch? Like, could you? Do we need a due diligence?
It's not something that can eliminate crunch by any means. If we look at some of the levels of due diligence done on larger development projects, they're incredibly thorough. It certainly helps to help screen, but again, as I mentioned, it quite often is not the supplier's fault that they're crunching. And you can start off with the best intentions, and then the project changes, and it moves and it grows, and we know this is not a fixed line. Our development is not a fixed line, so it's going to move. So you can't necessarily identify it then, because the drivers, the things that may cause it and the things that may bring it up aren't going to become apparent until well into the project. So it's something you can do to help sound out whether or not they are a supplier who will be honest with you, whether or not you can build a kind of relationship that will give you forewarning of that, and that you are able, as a developer, to empower them to do that with some confidence. So I would just accept the fact that development is always going to change. You're not going to eliminate it at the start in due diligence, and set up gateways. We talked there about the and chord, about something that can bring a stop to it, or at least give you a solid early warning. Put those in to accept the fact that things will change as you go.
Okay, this one comes from Eric. In a recent interview with Mike Wycon on Metroid Prime, he noted that crunch is often the result of feature creep in development, something you noted too in your presentation. What do you think is the best practice for avoiding creep?
I think, like I said, I think it speaks to the crunching decisions, not people, more than anything else. Feature creep is, we tend to explore every avenue. And we don't necessarily need to. We need to understand what the core of the game is, and what the core is of that we need to deliver. Feature creep, it's a kind of way of de-risking decisions. So you explore them all out and you find out whether or not it works, and then it pulls back afterwards. But by that time, it means something else is pushed. So I think that what we need to do all up as an industry is have a look at methods for de-risking decision making. So I can say crunch decisions, not people, but it doesn't mean the decisions any easier. So we need to find methods to make those decisions easier. And I think that there is a whole new topic and a whole area that we need to explore around de-risking how we make decisions and how we can perhaps make better decisions earlier.
Okay. This one comes from Cindy. Great job, Sam. Lots of great points. Her question is, how long before a project starts should an external partner be engaged by a dev buyer for better planning of teams? So
sorry, how long after the project starts, or before? Say that again?
Before a project starts. So, I mean, should you be like talking to your external partner like a month ahead, a week ahead? Like, is there like a sweet spot in there?
I don't know if there's a sweet spot there, but we do, the earlier the better is generally the rule for everything when it comes to external development. So as soon as you can start talking around production, as soon as you can start talking about how you're going to be handling it and what that looks like, the better. I think there's also a point there around contracts, because we can talk about production and committing and getting those resources in and how we monitor them and how we manage that. But quite often we can do that in the earlier stages, and without a contract in place, it's very hard for that supplier to then commit to that plan. So we can talk about it, but you're also asking them to hold resources in there and in place for a plan that hasn't got a dried ink contract. So I think we need to perhaps look at talking about production super early, but doing it with some kind of contract in place as well, so that we can do it with some confidence, and they can say, yes, we know that these are resources locked in. We know that this is what it's going to do. So a sweet spot is as early as humanly possible, and continue the conversations as the decisions start to change, as they always will in the run up to the contract actually starting, to the engagement starting.
Yeah. I agree with that. This one's from Grayson. How effective do you feel running regular postmortems with your external partners is? Do you think postmortems or a similar kind of production process can help bring these topics to light?
Again, these are postmortems are super useful, and when we have live service games, we can't wait till the end of something to have a postmortem. So it's almost like we need to have mini postmortems, a review set at specific parts, at specific points all the way through to help us with that. I think they're incredibly useful, and the work that the Gothenburg study did, they were all based around postmortems. And so a lot of the data that we got out there were all postmortems. I think there was over 100 or so that they actually reviewed on Gamasutra to be able to get that. And that data was absolutely invaluable. So what we get out of postmortems is absolutely invaluable. And the way that we can do that while giving the supplier confidence that they're not saying something that could damage the relationship. Because a postmortem, once it's all over, it's a lot easier to be honest. Postmortem during a project is harder to be honest, so we have to work harder on the relationship part and the confidence building with our suppliers to be able to be proactive in postmortems during the project itself.
Good points. Another question is it possible that the pandemic has increased the internal crunch culture in any way?
Yes, it's certainly going to make it easier to hide. If you are, especially if you're new to the company, or you're junior, it's very, very tempting to work extremely long hours and then just log them in as, look, here's the asset, regardless of the fact that you were up till 3 in the morning doing it. So I think that, yeah, it's made tracking it, whatever tracking we had or whatever tracking the studios had, it's made that more difficult. And it's also made it slightly easier to do in terms of you're always next to your work. And I think we've seen this in every industry in the pandemic, is that you're right next to your desk. So the temptation to overwork is incredibly strong. So yeah, I think it's absolutely had a big and possibly very negative impact.
Yeah, I know. Who knows when it's going to end too, so.
Well, there's something around that as well. I'm just thinking about one of the amazing things of this pandemic from an external supplier point of view is that the extent of negative damage we have seen from COVID in terms of productivity with external suppliers has been quite small. We've seen that when we look at the insights report and we've talked about it, it's quite clear that they're like, no, actually they've managed to transition really well. External suppliers have done this really well. And I can't help but think, how hard was that? So how much of that was hidden? Because there's no way it's an easy thing to do. Mm-hmm. And especially given the challenges around internet bandwidth, etc., in some of the countries, and where people are going to work from, and the equipment that then gets associated with that. There was no way that was easy. And I think almost looking at the reports of how well they've done is maybe an example of how crunch has been hidden. I suspect that every one of those suppliers that has managed to not disrupt production very much while they're changing over to work from home, it has been a very painful process and has involved a lot of late nights and a lot of sacrifice from the teams, but we haven't particularly seen it from the developer standpoint.
Looks like you should create your own reports and send it out to get numbers on this to see, what the results are. Yeah. So this one is from Chi, and it says, basically from external provider point of view, we also learn rather than try to please the client, it is important to learn how to say politely to try. Oh, okay, sorry, I just totally butchered that. So is it important for the vendor or the service provider to learn how to basically say no or how to push back on crunch? And is the developer going to be open and responsive to that?
Yeah, I think it's vital. I think this is absolutely a two-way street, and as an industry, we have to learn how to enable our suppliers to be able to do this with honesty. So yeah, I understand that it's a very difficult thing to do, and time zones as well make that even harder. It's the absence of information, the absence of communication is very rarely taken as a positive. If you don't hear back from somebody, you don't tend to fill that gap with positive feelings about what's happening to what they think of what you're doing and the assets you're doing, etc. So the same can happen when we're talking about how you feel about saying something awkward to a supplier, to a developer. So yes, I think your best approach to that is building a really good one-to-one relationship. It's probably not something to try and spread that out and get everybody to be able to speak up in the same way may be very difficult, but your one-to-one relationship with your counterpart, the developer, is going to be the way to do that. And maybe even setting some ground rules early when there isn't any problem. So when there is a problem, it can be harder to speak up. But if you at the very start of the project say, hey, look, this is a method for me saying we're going to be in trouble. And I want to set some ground rules. So it's okay for me to say this. And at this point, say 3 weeks before I think it's going to happen, I want to be able to speak to you about it comfortably.
That's actually a really good point. All right. Well, sadly, that's all the time we have for our Q&A. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in for Sam's session. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of XDS.
Thank you, everybody.